You're listening to The Brief, a podcast from the Business Council of Alberta. I'm your host, Scott Crockatt, and in each episode, we dive into the stories of innovation, economics, and the people working to make life better for all Albertans. Let's get into it. Mike, welcome back to The Brief. Before we dive into the details of Bill C-5 and its very, very long official name, I think it's important to set the stage here, why a bill like this might even be necessary. And you wrote this recent op-ed, which was kind of the catalyst to have this conversation on the podcast. And in there you said, Canadians are no better off today than they were 8 years ago. We're standing still while nearly every other major industrialized country is pulling further ahead. That paints a pretty stark picture. It sounds like for the better part of a decade, Canada's economy has been like, I don't know, let's use a Canadian analogy, like a car on the ice spinning its wheels. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of sound, but we're not actually moving forward. Can you explain this situation? How have we gone a decade spinning our wheels?
Well, first of all, that's a pretty good way of putting it. I think that businesses haven't been investing. It's getting harder and harder to get anything built. It's something that we say here a lot. It's something that that the Prime Minister acknowledged even before the election campaign happened. And we're not investing, we're not building, we're not an attractive place to do business compared to other places around the world. And so, as a result of that, we saw this huge decrease in oil and gas related in capital investment, and that's what was driving the entire country for years. And so that fell when oil prices crashed. Nothing else rose up to take its place, and then we had a series of legislative changes about 5 years ago or so that just made it harder to build things. And so we've seen investment continue to decline. We've seen productivity decrease, and we're ranked 37th out of 38 OECD countries in terms of per capita economic growth over the last 10 years or so. So it's not a good record.
37 out of 38, hey? Yeah, not exactly where you want to be. Okay, well, in policy circles, we're hearing this term more and more now of the lost decade. Do you think that's accurate? And if so, what exactly have we lost?
Well, we've lost any increase in our wealth and prosperity. Our per capita GDP it's a proxy for income. It's a proxy for how well off we are as individuals, and it's not perfect. I mean, it can be skewed by certain things, but any other measure that you can think of that would measure prosperity is usually very closely tied to per capita GDP, and we've seen pretty much no growth since 2017. So you and I and everybody else, on average, we're no better off than we were 8 years ago.
And meanwhile, our comparables, because many of these things are comparable, are doing much, much better. Particularly the United States would be up, 20%-ish over a similar period of time?
Yeah, a lot more than us for sure. And it's not just the United States either. So, this is, as I pointed out in that article, we're kind of standing still, and almost nobody else is except for whoever's in their 38th. It might be Luxembourg, I can't remember, but they're all growing. Everybody's getting better off, except for us. And so we're not. This is a growing problem, and it's one that we're starting to recognize as a country. So there's some silver lining there at least.
Well, we'll put in the show notes who actually is number 38th, and it'd be hilarious if it was Luxembourg because they're starting from a pretty high base. They have one of the highest per capita incomes on Earth or per capita GDPs on Earth.
I don't remember. I remember it's a small country though.
Okay, well we'll get to the bottom of that. Let's talk about the bill itself. Okay, and first, we need to actually name the bill itself. So in the policy circles, this is being called Bill C-5. Different than the Bill 5 in Ontario. This is the bill that's about building big things. And it has this enormously complex name that somehow manages to say act 3 times in it. So it's the One Canadian Economy, an act to enact the Free Trade and Labour Mobility in Canada Act, and the Building Canada Act.
Yes.
One of the acts is enact, but 4 times in there.
Right. So, I mean, it's the building, the first one, what's the first one called again there?
The One Canadian Economy.
Yeah, so that's the name of the act, and then that act enables 2 other acts. So it's kind of like it's like an org chart in a way. So you've got like a circle around the One Canadian Economy Act, and then it's got 2 branched out subcomponents that it's enabling 2 other pieces of legislation to happen. One is the building things, and then the other one is about removing interprovincial trade barriers.
Okay, so on the surface, this is about building big things and making it easier to work across the country.
Yes.
These are things that most people would agree are good. But as with any major policy, the devil's in the details. So what's your initial takeaways on Bill C-5? When you look under the hood, is this an effective piece of legislation?
Yeah, I'll probably want to focus on the Building Canada Act component of it because I think that's more or less what we're interested in here right now. It's a step in the right direction, I'd say, for sure. I mean, we are struggling as a country to have projects built. We have seen increasingly onerous conditions being placed on projects. Projects requiring political approval, cabinet approval, and that's asking companies to put millions and hundreds of millions of dollars and years into a review process that did not guarantee an outcome at the end of the day, and so we had these problems, and they were causing this investment to not happen, and so the intent behind this is to at least get some of these projects being built again, and so I have some concerns about how it's being done, but I think that. As a positive starting note, it's highly likely that more things will get built now than was the case before this act came in.
Okay, well, that's good news because heaven knows we've got to build more big things as Canadians. But you also point out a number of shortcomings or areas of concern. And a key promise of this bill is that we're going to get big things built faster. And talk to anybody that's tried to build a major project in Canada in the last few years, the last decade or so, and they'll describe some version of, like it's like trying to do a hike through molasses or something like that. Tell me what this bill promises or seeks to promise in terms of timelines, and is it likely to actually deliver them?
Well, the bill actually doesn't specify any timelines within it. This is an interesting thing. So the campaign promise was that projects would get built within 2 years instead of what was roughly considered to be a 5-year window under Bill C-69 or under the Impact Assessment Act.
The previous system, yeah.
Whether it was actually 5 years or not, it usually, in many cases, was longer. That's because you can press pause on that timeline at various stages along the way, and so often it was much longer than 5 years.
Yeah, didn't 5 years end up being sort of more like the minimum amount of time?
Yeah, I mean, there are 7 and 8 years easily in a number of cases, and I'm sure there are other worse ones that I can't remember off the top of my head. But there's so the idea, and the campaign promise was 2 years, and in some of the press material around the bill also said 2 years, but there's no timeline specified within it. And I think basically what the idea is that projects that are considered to be in the national interest, and we can come back to that in a second, but if it's considered to be in the national interest, then it basically will get shepherded through the review and permitting process within the federal government, may or may not skip certain steps along the way in order to expedite these things and just rush it through in order to have it get built. Now, the problem here, though, is that, we don't know what that means, really, and so that's one of the concerns with this, is that we don't know what steps are being skipped or accelerated or done with more minimal treatment than had been the case previously. So it's a bit of a black box in terms of how this is going to work exactly.
Right, and there's been a lot of talk about sort of a promised 2-year approval maximum, but the bill doesn't really create any hard teeth to enforce even that 2-year maximum, which might be a little long in itself.
Yeah, I mean, like you want projects to go through a credible process for environmental assessment, for impacts on communities, impacts on Indigenous communities, and incorporating an Indigenous consultation component to it. I mean, you want all those things to happen. I mean, you want a safe and reliable project that is supported. How long it takes to get there is, we'd love to see a process that does take shorter than 2 years. 2 years would be a massive improvement over 5, for sure. But we don't know. We really don't know what's going to happen. I think that one of the ways the federal government appears to be approaching this is very much on a case-by-case basis, depending on which projects it's going to put forward and prioritize. And so what that accelerated process might look like will probably or could vary from one project to the next. And so that would affect what the parts that get accelerated even are. So some conceivably could be approved faster, others might take longer, and we just don't know. It's probably why they didn't commit to 2 years in the legislation.
Right. You mentioned some of the Indigenous concerns and components of this bill. What are your concerns with the way that this bill intersects with Indigenous rights, Indigenous partnerships, and Indigenous communities?
Well, in conversations I had about this with some Indigenous leaders who were involved in this, that what I heard from them was a couple of things. One is that there was some concern about Bill C-5 itself, the very existence of this act. It was, I think, some Indigenous communities and leaders had thought that this was sprung on them, and they didn't see it coming. They weren't, finding out that a new and accelerated process was about to come into effect raises some potential concerns and some understandable concerns about whether the Indigenous consultation and economic participation component of these major projects is being skipped over, or you're going to run roughshod over it, or whatever. And so I think that was an initial concern about the bill itself, because there wasn't a lot of prior knowledge about what it contained. And then within what the bill promises is the second part of it too, where you've got, if you're moving this process from 5 years down to 2 years, what does that mean for Indigenous consultation? And so I think that is the secondary concern. And I don't have answers to that one. It's kind of up to the federal government about how that works. But I think that that's the nature of the concern, as I understand it.
Yeah, certainly. And if we're going to be successful as a country in getting major projects built, especially the long linear variety, which involve, the participation of a lot of different communities, and very often many of them Indigenous, we obviously have to get that right. You talked a little bit about winners and losers as one of the other concerns here. So let's bring up that classic Latin adage, "Qui bono."
Such a classic adage.
It's such a classic adage, certainly if you're a lawyer. Who are the potential winners and losers as you see them with this legislation?
Well, I mean, the winners are going to be projects that get this national interest designation. I mean, that's essentially what the bill stipulates, is that if a project is deemed to be in the national interest, then it will be identified as such, and then go through this accelerated process where you skip some steps along the way. How one gets that status is kind of where the winners and losers part comes in, because we don't know which projects are going to be considered that. There's some criteria that are laid out in the legislation. I mean, has to, if it generates economic growth, if it's good for national security, if it has a strong likelihood of going through, if it
benefits Indigenous reconciliation.
Yeah, that's another one. But I mean, the bill says it may include such considerations as those things that we just listed off. So I mean, in a sense, it kind of could be anything that the federal government decides, and that's what the winners and losers comes in. Like, does it meet the favor of the federal government, this particular project, and that's kind of what's going to be decided at the end of the day.
So the bill gives the federal government a lot of power to pick which projects are in the, quote, national interest. If we could take a peek in at the coach's playbook inside Prime Minister Carney's office, what potential national projects or types of projects do you expect are probably going to top this list?
Well, I think that, first of all, they're highly unlikely to lead with an oil and gas project, just for optics reasons. I think the kinds of projects that are most likely to go ahead will be things that either boost international trade as a way to shield against some of the action happening with the U.S., or an electricity transmission. So this kind of building more interties between provinces and up into the north potentially. So I think that areas like that where we can share our national strengths in clean electricity generation, I think is a priority for the federal government. Projects like the Pathways project would be a priority for the federal government, and then also trade corridors and things that will help us reach international markets faster and cheaper.
I think one of the other projects that we'll likely see on there, because there's just so much chatter about it lately, is the Grays Bay project for a new and expanded Arctic port. Virtually straight north of where we sit right now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, it just fits into that trade corridor and access point. So, helping us, be able to reach international markets better than we currently can.
Okay, I'd like to touch on one of the other just banger of a lines that you had in this op-ed piece that you wrote, and it's that your biggest concern with the act is not the act itself, but with the overall policy environment that made it necessary. Tell us about that and what other policy needs to change to make this act actually work the way it's intended.
Yeah, so the thing with that is that the problem that Bill C-5 is trying to solve, or one of the problems it's trying to solve, isn't the only problem that there is. And so the problem it's trying to solve is we've seen an increasingly a long and uncertain and increasingly onerous review and permitting process for major projects. And so that's the problem. And because of that problem, we've seen this decline in investment. But that's not the only thing that's causing this decline in investment. So if we're thinking about natural resource and energy projects, there's the tanker ban off the West Coast. There's the oil and gas emissions cap potentially. There's the clean electricity regulations. the greenwashing provisions in the Competition Act, and then the need for port modernization and automation, and there's a whole range of factors that are all contributing their own part to creating this relatively unattractive investment climate. And so those are all problems that need to be solved. And Bill C-5 takes an imperfect but a positive step in the direction of addressing one of those problems, but there's still lots left. And so it's one of those situations where, if you imagine yourself, I'm not sure if we used this analogy before, but if you're drowning because you're 10 feet underwater and somebody sticks a milk crate under your feet, and now you're only 9 feet underwater. I mean, you're still drowning, even though your situation has marginally improved.
Right. And even if you put 2 or 3 more milk crates and you say, look at all we've done for you.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, right. When you're still 7 feet underwater. So I think one of the concerns is that you can, if Bill C-5 comes into effect and projects get designated, but then we still don't see a huge rebound in investment in Canada. That's the problem that I'm potentially concerned about, because then the danger is the lesson that could be taken from that is, oh, well, I guess that wasn't the problem because fixing it didn't have any effect. There's lots of other things that we need to get right. And so it's not just the project approval process. It's this environment, this policy environment and regulatory environment that seems either ranging from indifferent to hostile to certain kinds of major project investment. And so that's the concern, is that if you don't address those other things as well, then this is going to have minimal effect.
In a country with the structure and size of Canada, there's often this sort of pressure or even historical momentum to designate a project in each region or each province and territory, and a different one that checks each box. Do you see that happening here, or do you anticipate that there'll be a really strategic and focused approach to this?
Bottom line is we don't know at the end of the day, so it's a bit conjectural, but I think that based on any federal government's track record, it's going to be pretty hard for them not to strategically distribute their first wave of projects across the country in some capacity. So maybe not necessarily. I mean, if we get to the point where we've got 5 projects that have been designated in the national interest, and there is a region of Canada that is not represented in one of those 5, I'd be very surprised.
The government's been talking about this since before the election. A version of this, what's now become Bill C-5 and this Building Canada plan, existed in the Liberal Party platform. If you think about that as sort of the advertisement for the brand new car, how is the floor model showing up compared to the as advertised version?
It's similar. There are a few areas where it's. I wouldn't necessarily say that it hasn't delivered as much as it hasn't had time to deliver yet. So one of the promises was that there'd be this creation of a major federal project office, is how it was worded there. And so this is the idea here, is this would be a department or an office within the federal government, and this had existed in the past with the Harper government, whose job it would be to shepherd projects through the internal bureaucratic machinations of the federal government. So they'd be in charge with basically running the project through and making sure that all the different departments and agencies and regulatory bodies within the federal government that have a role to play in this approval process did their jobs on time and got it through. And so
project management, coordination, concierge sort of system,
all that stuff, And so that hasn't happened yet, but we are getting strong indications that it will, likely will be announced in the next couple of months or so. So that hasn't happened yet, but it appears to be on the way. There's also a sense of moving forward with one project, one review, and so there's in the platform it said within 6 months we will sign cooperation and substitution agreements with all willing premiers as well as Indigenous governing bodies, allowing them to recognize their assessments. And so so that we're not at 6 months yet there either, but that hasn't. But we don't really have a lot to show on that front yet either. So in a sense, it's kind of a wait and see. Like I said, there's a positive steps being taken, but they haven't. So in some cases, it's unclear. There's a few problems. And in some cases, we haven't seen it all yet.
It sounds like it's a big yes to the intention, a yes to the ambition, a yes to the energy, but not a complete strategy. And we got to keep going because we haven't finished the race yet.
Yeah, it's a step in the right direction. There are flaws with it, but at the end of the day, will more projects get built now than would have been the case? Probably. whether
Almost certainly.
Almost certainly. But the other problem too is that there's part of the problem that this is all trying to solve is dealing with investor certainty. So if you have a certain process and you know what you're getting into and you know what the steps are and you have a good solid feeling or understanding that if you can jump through the hoops and prove all the things, that your project is going to get approved at the end of the day.
Right.
And so that's what where we want to be. Where we are now is some projects that get that national interest designation will have an accelerated thing. So it's a two-tier system, right? So these guys will get preferential treatment in some way, but anybody else, the problem, not only has that problem not been solved for them, that investor uncertainty problem, but now they have an extra layer of uncertainty about will they get that national interest designation or not. So that problem remains unaddressed.
So we'll get more major projects, which is unequivocally a good for Canada. You're always, with any piece of legislation, you're trying to produce more good and less bad, but we haven't fully solved for the investor certainty problem. Mike?
We have absolutely not solved for the investor certainty problem unless you get that national interest designation.
Great. Thanks for being on the pod.
Thank you.
That's a wrap, but the conversation doesn't stop here. If today's ideas inspired you, share the episode and help us keep the momentum going. You can also support the show by rating and reviewing us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in to The Brief.